नेटवर्क के फाउंडर और संसद में मेरे
Hello and welcome. I am Thomas Porteous and you're watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. LA Mayor Karen Bass has declared a curfew as troops flood the streets of Los Angeles amid protests against immigration raids. Governor Newsom slams Trump for inflaming the unrest and is now suing the federal government over its heavy-handed response. After 2 days of talks in London, the US and China say they've agreed in principle to a framework to cool trade tensions. The deal, which focuses on rare earth minerals and AI restrictions, now goes to Presidents Trump and Xi Jinping for a final send-off. A 9-minute Russian drone attack kills 2 and injures 54 in Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, with fires engulfing homes, a trolley depot and children among the wounded. Mayor Ihor Terekov called the damage devastating as rescuers worked through the night to pull victims from burning buildings. 10 people have now been killed in a horrific school shooting in Graz, Austria. The gunman, a 21-year-old former student, took his own life inside the building. Thousands of mourners gathered in silence for a candlelit vigil, turning the city's main square into a sea of light and grief. Rioters in Ballymena, Northern Ireland, torched homes and cars for a second straight night in what police are calling racially motivated disorder. Molotov cocktails, rocks and riot gear clashed as officers responded with water cannons and baton rounds. A US appeals court has allowed President Trump's sweeping Liberation Day tariffs to remain in effect, while it reviews a lower court's ruling that he overstepped his authority. Arguments are set for July the 31st, but for now the controversial import duties on China, Canada, Mexico and others stay in place. 24 bomb strikes blast police posts and civilian sites across Cali, Colombia, killing 7 and wounding 28 as gunfire erupts. Police blame a local guerrilla cell for the deadliest day since the failed assassination bid on a senator, raising fears of a 1990s-style violent spiral. In Argentina, ex-President Cristina Kirchner's 6-year jail term and lifetime ban from office are now final after the Supreme Court rejected her last appeal on Tuesday. Judges said the guilty verdict rested on abundant evidence, closing a major chapter in Argentina's corruption saga. Now to our top story, we move to North America, where Los Angeles is on edge tonight as the city struggles to contain a wave of violence sparked by anti-immigration protests. Mayor Karen Bass has declared a local emergency and imposed a curfew in parts of downtown LA after nearly 24 businesses were looted. The curfew, which covers a 1 square mile area, began at 8 p.m. and will last until 6 a.m. local time, and officials warn it may continue for several days. Meanwhile, Governor Gavin Newsom also addressed Californians earlier. Let's take a listen in to what he said during the press conference.
If you incite violence or destroy our communities, you're going to be held to account. That kind of criminal behavior will not be tolerated, full stop. Already more than 220 people have been arrested, and we're reviewing tapes to build additional cases, and people will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Again, thanks to our law enforcement officers and the majority of Angelenos who protested peacefully, the situation was winding down and was concentrated in just a few square blocks downtown. But that's not what Donald Trump wanted. He again chose escalation. He chose more force. He chose theatrics over public. Donald Trump, without consulting California law enforcement leaders, commandeered 2,000 of our state's National Guard members to deploy on our streets, illegally and for no reason. This brazen abuse of power by a sitting president inflamed a combustible situation, putting our people, our officers, and even our National Guard Just yesterday, we filed a legal challenge to Donald Trump's reckless deployment of American troops to a major American city. Today, we sought an emergency court order to stop the use of the American military to engage in law enforcement activities across Los Angeles. If some of us could be snatched off the streets without a warrant, based only on suspicion or skin color, then none of us are safe.
US President Donald Trump, on the other hand, has a different thought process. Let's take a listen in to what he stated.
Will be met with the protest. Oh, the military will be very heavy for us. I'm very proud to tell you that. They might as well turn around. They're wasting their time. Some of them will end up in jail for a long period of engagement. I just want to see peace. If there's peace, we get out. If there's even a chance of no peace, we stay there until there's peace. And a lot of people are being arrested. The rioters, or whatever you want to call them, they better know a lot of people are being arrested. They're going to be in jail for a long time. Thank you very much.
In just 24 hours, Los Angeles police have arrested 197 people as the city struggles to restore order. Protests continue as there seems to be no end to the unrest. Now we're joined by Jim Rice, Professor of International Law, located in Vigan, Philippines, to discuss this in further detail. Jim, thank you very much for joining us. Jim, this has been going on for a few days now. Donald Trump has put these troops on the streets. There's news of these protests dying down. However, Donald Trump's imposition of troops in the Los Angeles area has increased. What are your thoughts?
Well, thanks for having me on, Thomas. Again, I would agree with Mayor Bass and her decision to impose a curfew. I believe that the violence of in the protests is unacceptable, and the law should be enforced. However, I believe that Donald Trump has no interest in these protests or in this unrest being calmed down. Rather, he's trying to encourage it. I was in the Hong Kong protests in June of 2019, and since I was there, I can bear witness to the fact that the protests were completely peaceful until the police provoked the protesters by firing tear gas directly into the crowds. And this is the thing that caused the unrest. And it continued in 2020 when the Chinese government imposed a very, very draconian national security law on Hong Kong, which basically resulted in the arrest and detention of many of the protesters whose really only crime was to take part in peaceful protests.
Yes.
So again, I agree with Mayor Bass's action. I hope that the protests calm down. However, there's going to be a nationwide series of protests on the 14th of June. And I believe that Trump is just using this as a pretext to try and chill this otherwise peaceful protest.
Jim, a governor of one of the most safe democratic states in the United States and a Republican hardline president are outwardly criticizing each other's actions. Is there any legal precedent that Donald Trump used to override Governor Gavin Newsom's statements? He said he didn't want these troops on the streets of Los Angeles. Donald Trump has put them on anyway. What are your thoughts on this president-governor showdown?
Well, I agree with the governor in this dispute. I watched his speech just a few minutes ago. To try and answer your question as briefly as I can, there were a few incidents where the president overrode the governor, and that was in Alabama in 1965, 60 years ago, in which white racists were harassing and attacking civil rights protesters, including Martin Luther King. The other example where both the governor of California and the United States president brought on the National Guard in California was during the Rodney King riots of 1992.
Jim, critics of this believe that Donald Trump is making these riots political, as his immigration policy and deportation policy is one of his most signature policies, let's say. Obviously, these protests are protesting against said deportations. Do you think that is the case for the Trump administration?
There's no question about it. Trump did run on immigration, but of course what he did was he mischaracterized the issue. Rather than saying that he was going to be arresting and detaining and deporting dishwashers and farm workers and gardeners and people who put roofs on houses, in other words, hardworking men and women, he characterized the immigrants as the worst of the worst, people from insane asylums, rapists, murderers, and he used this to inflame the community and divide the nation.
Jim, and finally, we've seen the state of California now sue the Trump administration. Do you think there can be any momentum behind this legal precedent?
It's hard to predict what the courts will eventually decide. My guess is probably that the courts will give the benefit of the doubt to the executive branch, the president at this time. But it should be known by everyone that Trump is not trying to enforce law and order. Rather, he's trying to use this controversy for his own political purpose, which is to amass and consolidate his own political power.
Jim Rice, thank you very much for joining us on the programme and your insight as always. Now we move to Europe, where Russian strikes on Ukraine's northeastern city of Kharkiv have killed 2 people and wounded 54, including 8 children, according to the State Emergency Service. 17 strikes were carried out in 2 districts of the city and sparked fires in 15 units of a 5-storey apartment building, alongside other damage, as per Kharkiv Mayor Igor Terekov. The attack came after Russia's 2 biggest assaults of the war on Ukraine this week, as part of intensified bombardment that Moscow said were retaliatory measures for Kiev's recent attacks in Russia. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in his evening address, condemned the Russian strikes and called for stronger sanctions on Moscow and lower Russia oil price cap. Here's what he said.
Максимально обмежувати російський танкерний флот, їхні технологічні можливості видобутку і переробки, а також робити все, щоб ціна російської нафти була нижче, ніж вони можуть витримати. Кожен з партнерів знає, який прайс-кеп потрібен. $30, не вище.
Meanwhile, according to Russian state media, an Il-76MD aircraft carrying the second group of Russian servicemen freed from Ukrainian captivity has landed in the Moscow region. The servicemen were returned to Russia as part of an exchange agreement reached in Istanbul. In return, an equal number of Ukrainian servicemen were handed over to Kiev. Now let's move over to the Middle East, where Israeli Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir is pushing back after the United Kingdom announced sanctions against him and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich. The British government joined countries like Canada, Australia and New Zealand in imposing travel bans and asset freezes, citing the minister's conduct during the Gaza war. Ben-Gvir, unfazed, declared, quote, "We survived the pharaohs, we can also survive Keir Starmer." He vowed to continue serving Israel without fear. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Netanyahu will convene his cabinet on Thursday to discuss hostage talks with Hamas, amid what Israeli officials call tentative progress. And in a controversial interview, US Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee suggested that Muslim countries should offer land to host a future Palestinian state, a comment that's drawing strong global reactions. We now move on once again, There's been a new breakthrough in US-China trade negotiations. Officials from both countries say they've reached a framework aimed at stabilizing their trade relationship and lifting China's export restrictions on rare earth minerals. The announcement follows 2 days of intensive talks in London. US Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick described the deal as giving substance to a preliminary agreement reached last month in Geneva. That earlier effort had faced setbacks due to China's continued limits on exports of critical minerals, a move that prompted the US to impose its own restrictions on key technology exports to China. Lutnick said the latest framework includes plans to ease some of those US restrictions, although he did not provide specific details. Let's listen in to what Secretary Lutnick had to say.
We have reached a framework to implement the Geneva Consensus and the call between the two presidents, right? So that was on June 5th. So we've combined those two. We've reached a framework for implementation. Now the process will be, we're both going to go back. We, Ambassador Greer, myself, and Scott Bessent, who just left a little earlier, which you saw, because he's testifying tomorrow on the Hill. So the idea is we're going to go back and speak to President Trump and make sure he approves it. They're going to go back and speak to President Xi and make sure he approves it. And if that is approved, we will then implement the framework that we have worked hard over these last 2 days.
Meanwhile, China's Vice Commerce Minister Li Qiangang confirmed the agreement in a separate briefing. He characterized the talks as thorough and constructive, noting that the framework will now be reviewed by leaders in both countries. Let's hear from Vice Commerce Minister Li Qiangang.
In principle, both sides agreed on implementing the consensus reached by the two heads of state on the June 5th in the phone calls and also the Geneva talks.
As part of the agreement, Secretary Lutnick also stressed that lifting China's export bans on rare earth minerals and magnets will be a key component of the new trade framework. Let's listen in.
Absolutely expect that the topic of rare earth minerals and magnets with respect to the United States of America will be resolved in this framework implementation. That is a fundamental part of that. Also, there were a number of measures the United States of America put on when those rare earths were not coming. You should expect those to come off sort of, as President Trump said, in a balanced way. When they approve the licenses, then you should expect that our export implementation will come down as well.
We're now joined by Andrew KP Lung, who's a China strategist located in Hong Kong. Thank you very much, Andrew, for joining us on the programme. Andrew, I want to start about this deal, the possibility of lifting these rare earth export restrictions. Why is this such an important component of these US-China trade talks?
Well, because the rare earths is China's stranglehold on the Achilles heel of Americans' not only economy, but its military. Because China processes about 90% of the world's critical clear rare earth elements. For example, the rare earth known as salarium, China produces almost 100%. And this particular rare earth, which requires a great deal of processing, a lot of them is polluting and highly complicated processes which China has developed over decades. Apart from the extraction of this element, again, extremely polluting. This particular rare earth salarium, for example, is used in F-35 fighters and also in missile weaponry, because this is a kind of heat-resistant magnet which no other countries on Earth is producing. Now, this is only one of the examples. There are many, many different kinds of rare earths which find their used and embedded in various products, high technology products, defense industries, installations, all over the whole spectrum. The fact remains that even though China does not possess the deposits of all of these rare earths, China accounts for about 70% of the supply. But what is more important is the processing. China controls about 90% of the entire spectrum of processing of these rare earths, because each rare earth requires a different intricate process depending on the final component or product, and it requires a great deal of expertise and also infrastructure equipment, which China has been developing over decades. Because as I said, I mean, lots of this uprooting, and then the United States, even though it has access to rare earths, but only in one single state, accounting for only about 15% of the world's supply. But the most important thing is the processing. No other country can compare China. So I think that China is using this as a negotiating ploy. But of course, the trade tariffs are playing havoc on both sides. American economy, there's inflation, and also prices going up for American people, and of course China's economy is affected. So I think that both sides see that that's not the solution, because there is a huge imbalance in trade, in investments, in access to technology on both sides, and that's the reason why both sides choose to sit down and work it out. Now, the most important thing that this is a framework agreement, because as far as China's negotiation tactic or philosophy is concerned, it is not negotiating clause by clause, because the agreement on one clause could affect the agreement on others. For example, China wants the access to some of the critical technologies. If that is denied, it could impact on China's willingness to ease some of the restrictions on rare earths and other clauses. And hence, that is the need to develop a framework agreement so that both sides can go back to their capitals to see whether the whole framework is doable, because it contains both concessions as well as bonds.
Andrew, this, as you've just mentioned, this is a framework. They haven't finalised a deal here. What political hurdles must President Trump and President Xi jump over to finalise this deal, and what ways might this affect the wider impact of US-China relations?
Well, the wider context is, of course, there is a bipartisan consensus in the United States that China represents an existential threat to American dominance. China has now become the largest exporter, the largest manufacturer by a long shot across the whole spectrum of manufacturing, including shipping. And for example, China produces almost 70 or 90% of all the world's ships, and that will affect the strength of the U.S. Navy. And let alone the rare earths. But of course, China is embedded in the whole world supply and value chain. But I think that American also sees that there is an imbalance in trade, because American wants to sell more products to China, and there are certain restrictions or lack of access. And also, one critical issue is the perception of China's state subsidies. But of course, there are subsidies in the United States, for example, in the defense industry, the Biden sort of the CHIPS Act, and so on. So I think that both sides need to look at to the extent that they can compromise on certain issues. But basically, at the end of it all, the China model is very different from the American model. It is a mixture between capitalism and state intervention. It's unlikely that China would change the system entirely, but how to arrive at some sort of a compromise so that both sides then get what they want to promote a more stable relationship in the future.
Yes, Andrew KP Leung, thank you for joining us on the programme. For our next story, we move over to the United States, and Boeing is urging the Trump administration to maintain tariff-free status for airplanes and parts, warning that new duties could destabilise the US aviation industry. Documents released on Tuesday show broad opposition to potential new national security tariffs on commercial aircraft imports. Countries including China, Japan, Mexico and the European Union, alongside major airlines and plane makers, have called for the US to honour the duty-free principles of the 1979 Civil Aircraft Agreement. Boeing cites a recent deal with Britain as a model for future agreements. Meanwhile, US unions support some tariffs to protect jobs, even as airlines warn of higher ticket prices and supply chain risks. We stay in the United States, where the Federal Appeals Court allowed President Trump's broad tariffs to remain in effect while it reviews a lower court ruling that blocked them. The court made the ruling to allow Trump's Liberation Day tariffs on imports from the majority of US trading partners, as well as tariffs on Canada, China and Mexico, to remain in effect for the time being. The appeals court will decide if Trump had the authority to impose the tariffs under the Emergency Economic Powers Act. All 11 judges will hear the case, which the court calls exceptional. Arguments are set for July the 31st. A lower court ruled on May the 28th that only Congress can impose the tariffs, saying Trump exceeded his authority by using the Emergency Powers Act. This decision came from lawsuits filed by 12 states, led by Oregon and small businesses affected by the tariffs. The Trump administration appealed immediately, and the federal circuit temporarily paused the lower court's ruling. Trump argues the tariffs address issues like illegal fentanyl trafficking and the trade deficit, but opponents say these do not qualify as an emergency under the law. So far, no court has upheld Trump's use of emergency powers for these tariffs. Attorneys for the small businesses call the appeals court decision disappointing, but they say they remain confident and that they will win. The White House and Oregon have not commented on the decision. We now go to Africa where the Sudanese army has accused forces under Eastern Libyan military commander Khalifa Haftar of attacking border posts. This marks the first time Sudan has accused its northwestern neighbour of direct involvement in the country's two-year war. The conflict between Sudan's army and the paramilitary rapid support forces, who are also accused of participating in the broader attack, has drawn in multiple foreign countries. So far, international efforts to broker peace have been unsuccessful. Meanwhile, Haftar's forces have denied any involvement in the attack. They have accused the group affiliated with the Sudanese armed forces of attacking a military patrol while it was carrying out its duty to secure the Libyan side of the border. ABC News has announced that it will not review the contract of veteran correspondent Terry Moran following a controversial social media post. The post, which Moran has since deleted, included sharp criticism of President Donald Trump and his senior aide Stephen Miller. According to a spokesperson for ABC News, the decision comes at the end of Moran's current contract and cited the post as a clear violation of the network's policies. The spokesperson emphasised ABC's commitment to maintaining high standards of objectivity, fairness and professionalism in its journalism. In his deleted post, Moran called Stephen Miller and Donald Trump, quote, world-class haters, saying Miller is driven by hatred while Trump uses hatred for self-glorification. Moran, a veteran ABC correspondent since the year of 1997 and former Nightline co-anchor, was first suspended after the post. The network then decided not to renew his contract. The controversy came days after his interview with Trump, who called ABC fake news and criticised Moran's questions. Trump supporters, including Vice President J.D. Vance, condemned Moran's comments. This marks the end of Moran's long tenure with ABC News. Well, that is all we have time for, and we will continue to bring you more news updates from around the world. Thank you.